Hello friends, this is Angelica. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing how I like to stamp solid stamps. I'm going to stamp two ways and I'll be using Distress Oxide inks and Distress inks. I'm also going to be using a few products from scrapbook.com. This is the stamp set that I'm going to be working with. This is Sunshine Blooms, and I'll also be using the coordinating die to die cut the flowers and the stems. And I'll also be using scrapbook.com's mixed media paper to do my stamping with Distress Oxide inks. So the first thing that I need to do is run these dies through my die cut machine so I can stamp them. I pulled the paper out and I put it on my Anna Griffin Impress magnet sheet, and I'm just going to run that quickly through my machine, and then I put the negative into my MISTI that has a grip mat in it and put the flowers back in the negatives, and now I'm going to jump right into stamping. I pulled out some sponge daubers that coordinate with my Distress Oxide inks, and I'm going to use the sponge daubers just to spread the ink out a little bit on the solid stamps. You don't have to use Distress Oxide inks. You can do this with dye inks, but my sponge daubers are completely soaked with Distress Oxide inks, so that is what I'm using today. And the reason why I wanted to use Distress Oxide inks, or another reason why, is I like to mix my colors, and using the sponge daubers really helps blend those colors together. So for this first flower, I'm using Wild Honey, and I'm also using picked raspberries. The sponge dauber is going to help me keep the picked raspberry ink on the edge of the flowers, just to give the flower more of a radiant look and change the color values. And I'm going to stamp several times to build that color. Now, since I am stamping several times and I'm using the sponge dauber to add the ink, this does take a lot longer than just stamping the image one time. But to me, it is so well worth the extra time because it just gives your flowers a lot more character. Once I was done with the yellow flower, I pulled the flower out of the negative and I added another die cut. And this is why I love die cutting first before stamping, especially when I know I'm going to be stamping several images. That way I am not having to line up the die for every stamped image and run that through my die cut machine. It just makes the process so much quicker when you just die cut a whole bunch of blank paper, put it in the negative, line up the stamp one time, and you can just start stamping how many images that you want. This stamp set has 5 flowers in it and 3 stems, and then a couple little accent pieces that you can tuck in between your flower bouquet. I'm only going to be using 3 flowers from the stamp set. This is the second flower, and I started with Salvage Patina, and then for the edges I'm using Salty Ocean. I am going to be stamping two flowers of each size that I picked, and I'm making sure to pick colors so I have a nice rainbow variety of flowers to choose from when it comes time to putting the cards together. Now for the leaves and stems, I'll be using Twisted Citron as the first color, and then I'm going to darken the edges of the leaves with Uncharted Mariner. Now, I've talked about Uncharted Mariner before. This is actually my favorite color in the Distress family. I just think the color itself is beautiful, but it is also so much fun to use to bring depth into your stamped images. I love watercoloring, and this ink reminds me so much of Phthalo blue green shade, and that color I use a lot for mixing, and I kind of use the same with stamping with this ink. It's just going to really emphasize the edges of the leaves here, adding a touch of that on top of the Twisted Citron. Now that the flowers and stems are stamped, I am going to use the lined stamps that coordinate with the solid stamps to add lines to the flowers and to the single stem. So I put the stamps back into the negative. I lined the lined stamps up and used VersaFine Clear Nocturne ink to stamp the lines. Now, since I did all of my stamping in this negative, I am able to put the next set of flowers back into the negative and not have to move my stamps. I just get to re-ink the stamp and stamp again, and this saves so much time. Like I said before, I love stamping like this because I don't technically just stamp one flower and move on. I'm just going to stamp a few flowers since I have everything out, and it's going to take me a couple minutes to stamp one image anyway, so I might as well stamp more and put them aside for a different project in the future. Now, one thing I did forget to do before I stamped the lines was stamp the center of the flowers. And I wish I had remembered to do that first, because Distress Oxide inks are a bit opaque. So stamping them on top of the black line, I am going to lose a little bit of the just really bright black that the VersaFine Clear Nocturne ink gives. But that's okay. If I do this project again, I will be sure to stamp that center first. Now, I did decide on brown centers for the flowers, so I'm starting with tea dye, and then I'm going to bring in walnut stain and just ink half of that center of the center flowers, just to give it a bit of shading on the center. Now, like I said before, this does take longer than just stamping and moving on to the next step, just stamping with one ink. So this process probably took me about a half an hour, just to let you know how long it does take. I obviously sped this up a bit for time's sake, but this is how I love to stamp with Distress Oxide inks on solid stamps or on layered stamps. But now we are going to stamp in a different way. We're going to be using Distress inks this time. This is going to be one of the only times I don't die cut first, and that's because I'm going to be stamping each image several times. So I'm starting with picked raspberry, and I only put the ink on half of the flower. Now, distress inks are going to pool pretty much immediately on your stamp, so I'm going to use a water brush just to break that pooling up a little bit. And I'm stamping on watercolor paper. I'm using a 100% cotton watercolor paper, and I have that taped down in my MISTI because I do not want it to move at all, since I will be stamping each image 3 or 4 times, so I don't need that paper to move. I'm going to use the same water brush to even out the distress ink on the watercolor paper. And I did show this process before in a recent video, and I'll link that video down below, where I did this on large trees, and it turned out so pretty. I decided to do a lot more fun colors with these flowers, just to make the flowers a bit more funky than the trees, which were really pretty and really looked like they were watercolored. So this is called faux watercoloring, and I've seen it done before in the past, and I gotta tell you, it is so much fun. And I really hope if you have these products in your supplies, pull them out and try this technique, because it's relaxing and it's so satisfying that you get to put your touch into the stamping process. Now for this flower, I started with picked raspberry, and then for the second color, I'm using wild honey, just like I did with the Distress Oxide daisy. And I'm going to even those colors out again, and I'm stamping on textured paper. I'm using a cold press watercolor paper. I'm not a fan of doing this on a hot press watercolor paper or like a really smooth surface. I love the way that the textured paper, just the effect it gives, and when you're moving the ink around on the textured paper, it's really easy to fill in the crevices. I'm going to stamp again, and I want to even out those colors a little bit because right now the flower is pretty dramatic with half pink and half yellow, so I want to bring those colors together. I'm using the water pen to spread that ink out a little bit, and now the colors are going to start blending in together. I'm going to use the water pen again just to move the pigments around and start bringing like the yellow into the pink or the pink into the yellow. And I'm also starting to get this really pretty organic look, almost like a tie-dye. And I really love this messy look. I want it. That's why I called it funky. I just really want not a messy look, but just something completely different than the clean stamping we did before. When I'm choosing the colors that I want to have on each flower, I am making sure that they are pretty close to each other on the color wheel, especially since I am working with water and the colors are going to blend together. If you start using colors that are on the opposite side of the color wheel, that's when you're going to start getting neutral colors. They're going to turn gray or they're going to turn brown, and I just want to stay away from that. So right now I am stamping a yellow flower and I am inking the edges with a red. Now if I inked the edges with a purple, then it would make this, it's pretty, but it would make a gray, and that's not what I want. So just kind of, be careful and be thoughtful of the colors that you're using to blend together. And this is another way to add color to your flowers, is just by adding two colors to the stamp first and then blending those colors out with your water pen. And if you want to add a little bit more color to the center like I'm doing here, you can just add a little bit of ink onto the door of your MISTI and use your water pen to then bring that onto the stamp. Or you can also just paint right onto the flower too, which I did a couple times also. And you can see on the second smaller flower, I did use a blue and a purple just to give it a really dramatic look. I think it turned out so fun. Now for the stems, this is where I'm going to be able to bring in green. So I started with mowed lawn, and I am being a bit more careful spreading the ink out because I have a lot smaller space to work with. For my second color, I used peacock feathers, and that teal is just going to really brighten the leaves up. Uncharted Mariner would have been fantastic for this step also. I just don't have it in my Distress ink family, and I wanted to only use Distress inks instead of bringing in a Distress Oxide ink, which would kind of make the leaves a little cloudy. And yeah, I just stuck with the Distress inks in this process. For this last leaf or stem, I did stamp it first with old paper, and I did not like it at all. So I am trying to cover the old paper color up. It is a pretty color, but it just was a little too gray for this project. So now I am just using my water pen to bring in different colors instead of restamping the stamp. So I used salvage patina, peacock feathers, and I believe I used a little bit of mowed lawn too. And again, like I said, I'm using the water pen only, and it's really easy to paint onto the stem and to the leaves. You just follow the lines. I'm going to finish this stem up, and then before I stamp the lines, I am going to get the center of the flowers done, and I'm going to do it right into my MISTI. You can just use a stamping block if you want, but again, I'm going to be stamping the centers several times. So I'm going to do one on screen here. I'm using the same colors, starting with tea dye, and then I'm going to bring in walnut stain just to add a little bit of shading on the side of this center. And I also used my water pen to pick up the extra ink that I left on my door just to emphasize that shadow. Now it's time to stamp the lines, and this, you don't have to stamp the lines if you don't want to. I just like the way that the lines just really brighten the flowers up. I tend to like to watercolor with like the no line look, but I thought the black lines really brighten these flowers up. And if black is just too stark for you, use brown. That is another color I love to stamp my outlines with. Brown just really softens everything up. But for this flower, for these cards, I'm using black. And the stamps do not have an outlined stamp, so I'm going to use a fine liner pen, and I used a 01 tip and just drew in my own lines. I'm not the best line drawer, so it doesn't look really good, but you know, it's not going to be a focus on the card. It's just going to make the stem look more even with the flowers instead of not having a black line. The sentiment I'm stamping comes from the same stamp set, and I am using VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink again, so I have that same black as the lines, so everything coordinates, and there is a coordinating die in the die set to die cut this sentiment. A quick tip when die cutting this ink in particular, because it is a pigment ink, it is my favorite ink, so crisp and clean, but it sits on top of the paper, so it does take a while for it to dry. So if you run it through your die cut machine, it is going to leave some ink on your plate. So be sure to wipe your plate off so it doesn't contaminate the next project that you die cut. Now that everything is stamped and die cut, it's time to make arrangements to put on the card. So I'm starting with a white panel to make my arrangements. I love how the arrangements look, but I think the white is just a little too plain. So I'm going to run those panels through my die cut machine with a cover plate. This is the Bold Curves cover plate. It's a really easy plate to work with. So once I ran it through, I'm going to add adhesive to my card base and just slide those pieces right on it. And the waves are really easy to attach. You just follow the curves. So once I have all of the pieces on my card base, I am going to clean up the edges a little bit. So I trimmed both sides of the edges because I didn't line it up perfectly, which is fine. It's a really simple cleanup. And now I can build my arrangement. So I did take a picture of my final arrangement with my phone just so I have a reference, and I have that off to the side. I'm using thin foam squares to attach the flowers first, and I'm using 1mm foam, and then I'm going to add the sentiment with 2mm foam just to give it a little bit more lift than the flowers. For the second panel that I have on screen here with the bigger bouquet, I thought the wavy sun cover plate would be really pretty on a card base. So I ran that through my die cut machine on top of white cardstock, so I have the same white on white look, and got that right onto a card base. I used a little bit of dry adhesive and glue, and then I'm just going to rebuild the bouquet that I had already arranged. I'll be using thin foam squares again on the flowers, or thin foam strips. And these foam strips are from scrapbook.com, as is the dry adhesive. I'm using the adhesive roller, and I will have everything linked down below, so you can go and check out these adhesives. I really like them. This tape runner is really strong, and the foam is strong, but you can still kind of move the pieces around if you don't really like the position that it's first in. Now, the last step I'm going to do, and this was an afterthought, but I thought it was just a little too white, so I'm going to do some black splatter on the card. I did cover the sentiment because I don't want black splatter on the sentiment, but everything else, I'm going to just splatter the softest amount of luster black. I'm using the luster brush marker from scrapbook.com. I made sure that the tip was loaded with the black ink, and then I just gently tapped the brush a couple times to get the black splatter onto the card. I did end up with 4 cards with all the flowers that I made, and we're going to take a final look at them. Now, these 2 cards are the watercolor cards, and you can just see how fun the colors turned out and how the bouquets look. And I'm also going to do a side-by-side comparison of a stamped card with the same layout, so you can see the difference between the Oxide stamped images and the watercolored images. I will have links down in the description box if you want to go check out my blog, my Instagram. Also, I have a gallery on scrapbook.com site. So you can head over there, see all the projects that I've made, and then there is a supply list of the products that I use. So if there's anything that you like, you can just click on that product and go take a quick look. And then you can see what other projects have been made with that product if you go all the way down to the end of the page. That is all that I have for today. Be sure to subscribe if you would like to see more from my channel. I'm going to be back shortly with another video, so I'll see you then. Take care, friends.